I'm gonna.
All right. Well, I'll admit the people in a second.
Sure.
I bet lots of people will watch this remotely too. One did.
There'll be far more on this recording than.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. My name is Andrew Holmes. I'm the UK National Administrator of the Jessup Moot. I'm also a circuit judge in my spare time. I did the Jessup in 1998 and I've been judging ever since. I've been involved in the administration of the competition for the last 15 years and National Administrator for the last 5. And the purpose of today's session is to give those who are not as familiar with the competition some background as to what it is, why it might be a good thing to do, how, if you do decide to do it, you might go about taking part and doing as well as you can. We're going to divide the session into 2 halves. The first half is going to have a few people talking about the impact the competition has had on them and their careers, what they learned from doing it, and I suppose trying to pass on the message that it may be a good thing for you to contemplate doing. The second half will have a discussion about how you might go about it, so how you might form a team, go about the research, putting together readings and those sorts of things. If you're not part of the panel, if you wouldn't mind making sure you're on mute, I would be very grateful. If you want to ask a question at any stage, please put it in the chat, and questions are very much welcomed, and we'll do our very best to answer any questions that you might have. So in terms of the panel for the first section of this, we have 3 people. The first is Dr. Rumiana Yotova. She obtained her bachelor's degree from the University of Sofia in Bulgaria, a master's in Leiden and a PhD from Cambridge. She's now Associate Professor of Law at Gomble & Keys College in Cambridge and Assistant Professor of International Law in the University of Cambridge. She participated in the Jessup in 2006 and reached the international rounds and has been judging ever since. And she's now a member of the Board of Directors of the International Law Students Association, which runs the Jessup, and we're very grateful to have her here. Ron Kendler is counsel in the Washington office of White & Case. White & Case, as you may well know, has been a sponsor of the Jessup competition for many, many years now and has supported it, I think, certainly for the last 15 years. And we're obviously always very grateful to them for their assistance. And it's particularly good, therefore, to have Ron here to talk about his perspective and perhaps a little bit about White & Case's perspective on why the Jessup is such a good thing. He took his JD from Bastin College Law School in the US, member of their Jessup team, went to the international rounds, and I think was ranked 6th best oralist in the competition, so he must know something about what he was doing, and now works in the international trade group at White & Case. And finally, but by no means least, Lucas Bastin, King's Counsel, barrister at Essex Court Chambers, called to the bar in Australia in 2007, in England and Wales in 2013, and took silk 3 years ago. He actually won the whole Jessup Moot competition in 2007, representing the University of Sydney, sadly beating the last United Kingdom team to make it to the final in Washington. We won't hold that against Lucas too much. He obtained his BCL and DPhil from the University of Oxford and now practices commercial litigation with an international element. So I'm going to ask each of them to spend 5 minutes or so talking about the Jessup from their perspective, what their experience was of doing it, and what they've learned from it and why it has been useful for them in their practice. So we may as well do it in the order I introduced them. Rumiana, do you want to say something?
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So I actually took part for the first time in 2005, 20 years ago, and it was, I still remember the case. It was a case about the law of the sea, piracy, and the protection of the environment. And I think Dagmar had something to do with that case because the pirate may have been named after a personal friend of hers. So for me, the Jessup, I think I can honestly say, changed my life and the whole course of my career. I wouldn't be doing international law. I wouldn't be in Cambridge had it not been for the Jessup. So I would really encourage you, if you are serious about international law and mooting, to do the Jessup, because it will change your life in ways that you cannot anticipate. It's very much the Olympics of international law. And it doesn't matter whether you qualify to the international rounds, whether you win the Jessup, it will have a huge positive impact, unlike anything else. What did the Jessup do for me? Well, first, it gave me an opportunity to teach myself international law in English, because in Bulgaria we have a very different style of learning about international law. It doesn't involve any cases, it doesn't involve any English textbooks, so this was my first encounter with international law as taught in the Commonwealth. It also allowed me, it ignited the passion for international law. Going to the international rounds was like a dream come true. We didn't qualify. We were the only team from Bulgaria. There hadn't been a team for 11 years. So we were very much starting from scratch. And going to the international rounds was also baptism by fire, because we hadn't had qualifying rounds, we hadn't had practice rounds, but we did learn a lot about advocacy, about international law. We met a lot of people, and I have to say, I made lifelong friendships. At least three of them are in the room at the moment, but also I met people who I'm colleagues with in Cambridge at that Jessup first participation. And I also met my PhD supervisor there. Professor James Crawford was judging the final round in 2005. And some years later, he became my PhD supervisor here in Cambridge. So I guess the Jessup is not just about international law. It's also very much about the people and friends you make that may well be with you for life. So that's all I had to say, but I'd be really interested in engaging further. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rumiana. Ron, do you want to say something?
Certainly. Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you for your glowing introduction. As Andrew mentioned, my name is Ron Kemler. I'm a counsel with the International Trade Group of White & Case based in Washington, D.C., though I did start with the firm in our Geneva, Switzerland office where I worked for a few years, and that ties in a way I'll bring up shortly. Let me first start by saying that White & Case is and remains proud to be the global sponsor of the Jessup. We consider it a cornerstone of our contribution to the legal community and the international legal community in particular, White & Case being a leading global law firm. So as Andrew mentioned, I did the Jessup competition. It was 2012, which feels a lot closer than it actually is every year. I too remember my problem, the Mai Takao Temple, which had to do with governments in exile and the use of force, matters particularly salient at that time when the world was experiencing the Arab Spring political revolutions. I'll just speak briefly to my experience as a student. I think the Jessup is probably the best thing I did in law school. And it is the best thing I did in law school for a few reasons. One is just the skills that it contributes to the development of, both writing, research, advocacy, oral argument. All of these things are day in, day out what I do as a practicing lawyer in the field of international trade. And to get hands-on experience in a way that, it's not identical to the practice of law. I wasn't representing real clients the way I do now, but it was essentially trial by fire for my own personal skills, but then also in working with the team. Every day I work with colleagues at White & Case on legal matters, and no one person does everything. So the ability to develop those skills, again, oral argument, research, writing, but then also craft a strategy with teammates was invaluable for my development as a lawyer and into what I do every day. I was also particularly struck when Rumiana mentioned the Olympics of international law, because I remember having made it to the international rounds, being in the lobby of what then was the Washington Hilton, where the competition was held. And I saw just so many law students running around with the flags of their countries in a way that felt like the Olympics, but then everyone was dressed in a business suit. And so it felt like this bizarre amalgam of the Olympics and the United Nations. And I say that because the beauty of the Jessup, and this is true whether you make it to the international rounds or whether you just compete in a national round, the beauty of the Jessup is in the esprit de corps of people who are just there. We're all, and I say this not pejoratively, but we're all massive nerds, and we're proud and excited and energetic to do what we're doing. And so I say, if nothing else, do the Jessup for that, for the community that it fosters, because I, as a competitor, and then every year since graduating from law school, have judged Jessup rounds in the United States and abroad. There is a real community that once you have gone through the Jessup becomes part of your life, not just as a lawyer, but as a person. And it's one that I still, every year when I judge the Jessup, have the opportunity to build upon that community and add members to it. So I wholeheartedly, as a former competitor, as a lawyer at White & Case, and as a member of the Jessup community, urge you to participate and explore this wonderful experience and competition. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ron. Lucas?
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Rumiana and Ron. I did the Jessup in 2007, and I think that the main takeaway for my life and professional activities after boil down to 3 lessons that I think anyone who completes the Jessup program will learn. I'm going to just walk through those very quickly and then give a little footnote at the end. The first lesson is effort. Everyone puts in effort at law school. Law school is not easy. Hard work is required. Jessup is harder. It requires more effort. It requires more hours, more reading than any other undertaking you will do at law school, including a dissertation. That's an important training tool, because sometimes a step up from the effort that's required in law school to the effort that's required in practice is not well explained to students, and certainly there's no lived experience of it. Jessup is, I think, the closest way to which a student can achieve that type of effort that approximates what's required in your post-university life. The second lesson is accountability. I don't want to speak for everyone on the call, but you can read their facial reactions. But I will confess myself that there were some assessments at law school where my accountability to myself when I was doing it alone was perhaps not as high as it should have been, especially if there was other activities on a weekend or on an evening that I was interested in doing. And when you are alone, there's no one else to judge you for your decision to prioritize other activities than yourself. In Jessup, you are not alone. You have the requirement to meet the expectations of others and, like a helix, to try and lift one another up. That improves accountability. And when you come out of law school and you're in practice, that type of collective accountability, with all eyes watching for every good step and every not so good step that you take, it's an important lesson to have. The third lesson, though, is the flip side of the second, which is collegiality. And both Rumiana and Ron have really touched on this already. The type of teamwork that is required when you are working in practice is not one that's easily replicated in law school, not even the little group exercises that you are sometimes forced to do. The closest approximation, again, to that practical reality you have in professional life is Jessup. And that collegiality is both in the professional working sense, but also, as Rumiana and Ron indicated, in the social sense. It is correct that in the final I was opposite the King's College London, but I remain friends with the people who are in that team and their coach as well, even to the extent that I am now a visiting lecturer at King's College London and help their Jessup team every year. I don't know if I'm trying to expatiate some guilt, but there you have it. The footnote that I want to add is that once Rumiana and Ron have talked about the Olympics, I can't help but jump on that bandwagon. Jessup is also a great outlet for youthful enthusiasm and an opportunity to integrate into the profession in the way that Rumiana described. It's actually quite hard in many professions as a student to have access to senior people who are enthusiastic about a similar activity or topic. Sometimes you have it with a thesis supervisor. Sometimes you might get lucky, and as a paralegal, you'll form a connection with partners in a firm or what have you. Jessup is a very quick route to that type of integration into the profession, and a way in which enthusiasm, which is an attribute of youth, can be parlayed into practical experience that helps you in your profession.
Thank you very much indeed, Lucas. please, if anybody has a question that they particularly want any of the three people to address, then please do put it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask the question. But whilst we're waiting for those sort of first questions to come along, I suppose one thing I wanted to ask, I suspect you all did different forms of mooting as well as the Jessup. Was there anything in particular about the Jessup as opposed to other moots that you did that was particularly helpful in terms of future practice? Lucas, you're unmuted. Do you want to have a go first?
Sure. I think the short answer I'd give to that is scale and enjoyment. I did do other moots before signing up for the Jessup, but none were as big, both in terms of the problem that you are given and then the number of participants. And if you are an enjoyer of mooting, being able to get stuck into a full meal, a full plate of food to devour in your mooting life is something that is really excellent. I don't think that prior experience in mooting is required, but I know that I did some mooting at law school before I ended up in the Jessup, and it was just an activity that I enjoyed, and I was keen to take it on the biggest scale in the end, which is the Jessup.
Thank you. Ron, Rumiana, anything you want to add to that?
Sure. I'll say that the level of familiarity and experience of the judges, both at the international and national level, is something that is, I won't go as far as to say particularly unique to the Jessup, but I think especially significant. Being pushed on depth and meaning of international law in the Jessup moots is something I think that is a hallmark of the experience. You're not going to be, as we say, pulling the wool over anyone's eyes with responses that are not thoroughly considered and well researched. And one of my most shining Jessup memories was when I'd had a guy, I don't know if anyone on this call remembers Dan Gutterman, may he rest in peace. But he led me down a rabbit's hole of questions, I think past 4 or 5 iterations, where I had to keep pulling cases from my reserve to answer particular questions of law. And so I think that is something that is unique to the Jessup. If I may, Andrew, I do see some written questions that I can tie my response into just very quickly. I mean, I think Lucas already touched on this. You know, there's no particular level of mooting experience that I would say is required. It would certainly benefit, but I would encourage you to think of it in the other way, that Jessup is the activity that will give you that mooting experience. And then, so that was Ibrahim's question. And then just to Grace's question, I think a passion for advocacy and public speaking is certainly enough to participate. I think it would be enhanced by an interest in international law. With that, I feel that with my passion for speaking, I've gone on too long, and we'll hand it off to Rumiana.
Rumi.
Thank you. I just wanted to reinforce the point about the depth of engagement with international law that you get at the Jessup. I've participated in a EU law moot court. I coached the elders, but nothing compares in terms of in-depth engagement with the Jessup. And the other great difference, I would say, is how international it is. The teams you're going to compete against, the judges you're going to have, it is truly international, unlike any other moot court, which makes it very enjoyable.
Yeah, I think the three of you have pretty much covered the 3 questions we've got so far. I mean, in terms of mooting experience, I suppose the answer I think we're collectively giving is some would be useful, but it's by no means essential. And there are people who do the competition every year who haven't done any mooting in the past. It's probably unlikely that you got to law school and don't have any public speaking experience, but in some ways, why not start as you mean to go on with something that really is going to test and give you an opportunity, because you have to moot a number of times, so you can get better as those particular moots go on. Is it primarily for those interested in international law? I would say not. I mean, it's the vast majority of people, in my experience, who've done the Jessup do not go on to practice international law. And perhaps in selecting the people speaking this evening, I've picked out a subset which would suggest that that is the case, because each and every one of them does do international law to a degree in terms of their practice. But the vast majority of us don't. I don't do international law in my day-to-day job. And I think that's probably true of the vast majority of people who do the Jessup. It gives you an introduction to a different area of law that you might not have come across and you might not otherwise come across. And it is endlessly fascinating when we look at politics in the world today and the news headlines. Having an idea as to what the international legal principles are that are underlying what those politicians are saying is, I would say, a good thing in itself. Probably enough from me. There's a question, is it any particular area of international law or based on topical issues of international law? Lucas, I suppose you can probably give us an idea on that.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It is on topical issues of international law from year to year. And so what you will tend to see is that the Jessup compromis will reflect issues that have arisen in the world over the past 12, 24 months or so. So you are not necessarily going to be assessed or judged on general issues of international law. But of course, during questioning, general matters of international law may well come up, and you may need to answer questions at a level of generality that goes beyond the specific topics that are tested in the compromis. But I remember in my year of the compromis, we had some very narrow areas. We had diplomatic immunity, which is perhaps reasonably common in Jessup sort of history. But then we also had questions about accession to customs unions and illegal expropriation, which from my knowledge is not particularly common in Jessup history. So you end up having quite a deep well of knowledge around topical issues of international law, which you then might supplement with more general knowledge to ensure that you're well situated in your responses to the judges.
Thank you. There's a question, Rumiana, which you may be able to help with, which is whether the Jessup is something for a first-year LLB student and whether they'd be able to meet the challenges of it, or whether it's aimed at somebody with a bit more experience under their belt.
That's a great question. So if I put my coach hat on, I would say you would probably benefit the most from the Jessup once you have done international law as a paper. So different universities do it in different years. In Cambridge, we offer it as an optional paper in years 2 and 3. That's not to say you can't do it if you haven't studied international law, but you are going to face a very steep learning curve because, as Lucas was saying, the Jessup question is different every year. It's unique, it's exciting, but it is always firmly grounded in the basics of international law, in the sources, the law of state responsibility. So having a good grasp of those basics would make it much easier to go in depth in the specific areas and topical issues that the compromis deals with. So it's up to you, but if you want to do the Jessup, I'd probably say to make the most of it, wait until you've done the paper international law and then participate. Or have a baptism by fire, up to you.
Well, for those that are going to do it as a baptism as fire, not every university sadly teaches international law, certainly not to the standard that you do at Cambridge. Is that one of the long-time friends of the Jessup in the UK, James Summers, is a lecturer at Lancaster University, has recorded some podcasts which are going to give an introduction, and we're going to release those in the next few days. So it should at least give people who don't have that background in international law as yet some insight as to what the essential basics are. But I don't disagree with Rumi that you're going to need to do quite a lot of reading around the subject more generally if you haven't had at least some basic introduction to international law as we go along. There's a question about the structure. I think we'll come to that in the second half if we may. So are there any more questions that anybody would like to ask of our 3 distinguished panelists from the first half before we sort of get into the nitty-gritty of how you go about doing the Jessup if you're going to? I'm going to take that as a silence. So if I may, I'm going to thank Lucas, Ron and Rumiana for your kind participation and for sharing your experience of the competition. I'm extremely grateful to each one of you. You're very welcome to stay around and participate in the next bit if you're able to, but thank you very much indeed. The second part of it is really about the basics, and we've got a question which starts off one of those issues. But before we get to that, I'm just going to very, very briefly introduce the 4 people we've got to speak in this section. Dagmar Butte is been involved in Jessup for even longer than I have, and there aren't many people these days who can say that. She doesn't look like she has, but she certainly has. She competed for Lewis and Clark Law School in the US, advanced the international rounds pretty much like everybody else who's participating in this, and has remained active in the Jessup ever since. She's coached the Lewis and Clark Jessup team, I think, for over 30 years, and must have judged countless moots by now. I think written 3 Jessup problems along the way. And
4.
4, you see, I even miscounted, and been a member of the board of ILSA and its past chair. And she's an immigration attorney in the US, being a partner in a firm in Portland in Oregon. Madhavi Gerbitz coached the successful UCL team last year to the national championship, and therefore took the UCL team to Washington, DC, and will be able to give us her insight as to what she learned along the way from that experience. Armand Rosen as a member of the KCL team, King's College London, in 2023. They went to the international rounds, and I think coached the King's team last year, or was one of the coaches of the King's team last year, and is now doing his BCL at Oxford. And Joshua Gann was a member of the UCL team, which won the UK national round in 2024. Went off to Washington, DC, and I think was 12th best oralist in the international round, so did reasonably well in terms of his participation, which, given there must be several hundred students, tells you that he really did do remarkably well. But I'm just going to start, before I ask them just to say a few words, just before I sort of forget, in terms of the structure. The structure of the competition is 2 parts. The first is a national round, and then the second part is the international rounds. And effectively, the national round not only crowns a national champion, but decides who's going to qualify to go to Washington, DC. The national round this year will be held at Lincoln's Inn in London from the 26th of February to the 1st of March, if I've got those dates right. It's a Thursday through to a Sunday. Maybe shortened to Friday through to Sunday if there aren't enough teams, but early registration is looking very encouraging, and I suspect we will need 4 days to get through the competition. Each team moots 4 times in the preliminary rounds, twice as applicant, twice as respondent. And I think that's a really good thing in this competition, because it gives you the chance to make a mistake and learn from it and get better as you go along. And it's not like a domestic moot where you moot once, you get knocked out, or you get through an entirely different question, and you have to go from scratch in relation to that. So preliminary rounds then will probably have a runoff round between teams ranked 5th through 12, and then quarterfinals, semi-finals, and a final over the course of the competition. I think probably 4 teams from the UK will go to Washington, DC. Again, it depends on the number of teams that participate. There's a formula that works it out, but I suspect it'll be 4 teams that qualify to go to Washington. And Washington is just an awful lot bigger, but organised in the same way. Each team has 4 preliminary rounds, twice as applicant, twice as respondent, and then there are far more elimination rounds because there are significantly more teams to participate. So that's the general structure of the competitions. Anything more specific, just put an additional question in the chat and we'll get through. But with that out of the way, Dagmar, what do you want to say about the competition as a whole?
Well, I think that this competition will hone skills, as several people on this call have already said, even if you are not going to be an international lawyer. And I suspect the vast majority of participants in Jessup are not fortunate enough to get to do international law. So I would encourage people to look at this as a learning opportunity that they take beyond just this competition. I very much agree with some earlier comments regarding the effort that gets put in, but I somewhat disagree on the trial by fire, because I think it's true that most schools don't offer the depth of learning that, for example, Cambridge may offer in this subject area. So I would encourage people to take a look, not just at the materials that Andrew's going to be sending out, but also the student resources that are on the ilsa.org website. There is just a brief summary of general public international law that I think is helpful. There are some materials regarding the grading rubrics that I think will be very, very helpful for students preparing for the competition, which includes the score sheet. I think practice, practice, practice is really the most critical thing as you lead up to the competition itself. I know you have other demands on you, including your coursework and your own private lives, and possibly even if you're working part-time while you're going to school, you have that demand. But if you do not practice, and by that I mean, for example, with respect to oral argument, out loud in front of someone, okay? Not just in the however many practice rounds you schedule, but in addition to that, if you don't practice, 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 you're not going to succeed at this because it is a somewhat artificial construct. So I think that's my biggest piece of advice is don't underestimate yourself and just practice until you feel like you just don't want to do another practice again. And at that point, you'll be almost there.
Brilliant, thank you. Madhavi, what do you want to say about your experience with the Jessup?
Hi, everyone. I coached last year's, or I suppose this year's championship team, and I participated the year before. To kind of echo what Dagmar was saying, prior to doing the Jessup, I didn't do any public international law, so I was really thrown in the deep end, but I would recommend it to anyone. I think also because aspects of the Jessup are incredibly niche. You won't be familiar with them even if you do have a public international law background. And members of our team this year that did incredibly well were final year undergraduate students that hadn't done public international law before either. As far as advice goes, I think the most important thing to remember from beginning to end, whether you're coaching or whether you're participating as a competitor, is that you are a team at the end of the day. And I think that's super important from a coach's perspective when it comes to selecting members of the team, but also while you're in the team, when it comes to divvying up work responsibilities, supporting each other through oral arguments, to remember that you cannot win Jessup alone. It doesn't work that way. It is a team competition. And as a coach, some advice I would give is in line with the whole Olympics aspect of Jessup. I think the most important thing you can do as a coach is to try to bring out the best in the individuals in your team, whether that be encouraging them to look at all sorts of, to leave no stone unturned, whether it comes to testing oral arguments, which is incredibly important, just to try to prepare them as best you can. And I think it's an incredible learning opportunity. It really is what you make of it at the end of the day. And if you fully launch yourself into it, you never really have this type of opportunity again in your life to become a complete nerd for a completely niche area of law. And going to law school is kind of what presents this unique opportunity to you. So I would definitely take part, again, knowing what I know now.
Brilliant, thank you. Armand, what's your perspective?
Thank you, and good afternoon. My perspective, to not repeat what's already been said, very good points already made, and I think that we're going to address various aspects of research and mooting and whatnot later on in the panel. But I think the first thing I'd like to say is that Jessup can be very daunting and it will be very different from studies. But that's what makes it brilliant, particularly as a participant. Public international law can be very academic. I didn't study PIL before taking part in Jessup, and it required some learning, but it wasn't unmanageable. But in Jessup, you're not addressing things from an academic perspective. You are trying to win a case for a client. So it's a very different challenge and a very enriching one. It gives you a pragmatic approach, which law school just doesn't. But it also rewards knowledge in a way which university exams don't. University exams you can game in some respects, whereas with judges, there isn't necessarily anywhere to hide. So you learn to develop as a speaker and as someone who's knowledgeable on your particular area of law. But I think in terms of benefits, Jessup is rewarding in that it allows one to become the best advocate one can be. There isn't a single mold for a good advocate. Different people have very different styles with extremely good effects, good results. And Jessup is the perfect opportunity for that, partly down to the structure, which Andrew has explained. You have the opportunity to really test your abilities. So I would say that it's a rare opportunity, and a rare opportunity not just to advocate in that way, but also to take part in legal drafting, which again is worlds apart from essay writing. Your job is to persuade and to build trust as an authority to be able to explain and to win your case. So I'll leave it there until we have further questions.
Thank you very much. Joshua, finally, what do you want to say?
Everyone else has made very good points that I completely concur and agree with. But I will just add one thing, because traditionally, if you do the Jessup, you might seem to have a passion or affinity for the bar. But I do say that the skills you develop can also apply very well in a commercial setting. I'm currently a trainee solicitor at a law firm in London, and I find that the skills I developed during the Jessup helped immensely, be it through resilience, be it through the amounts of research you've done, be it through teamwork, and just overall attention to detail, because the Jessup is very demanding, and it demands you to look through copious amounts of document. During my time, I'd probably gone through about 300 pages of the Travaux Preparatoires of the Statelessness Convention. And it's one of those things where even though you might not be interested in a career that's advocacy heavy, there are still benefits to come out of it. So I'd encourage everyone to still sign up for it regardless, because prior to doing the Jessup, I never thought that I wanted to do advocacy or that I wanted a disputes leaning future and / career. But ever since doing that, that's changed. So
brilliant, thank you. Right, I'm going to ask a series of questions, and I'm going to direct it to one of you each. But of course, everyone, please do chip in and give your perspective on it as well. Dagmar, how do you go about selecting a good Jessup team?
Well, there's a lot of different ways to do it. I'll tell you how we do it, and then I'll make some suggestions based on what I know about others. We actually have a course because we don't select our team till November. And so we have an academic course which allows us to take people who have no background in public international law, no background in advocacy or public speaking, and train them for approximately 8-9 weeks on a hypothetical problem that we've been using for a number of years, just to see how they respond to difficult challenges on substantive areas they might not be familiar with. We do some practice rounds with them, very short ones, no more than 10 minutes a speaker, to see how they respond to questions. And we gauge all of that throughout the course of class. We bring in some volunteers from our Jessup community to judge these little mini practices. We take that data, then we have an in-school competition where they don't write anything. They simply do an argument on this little in-school problem we have. And then they do have a couple of short writing assignments, and they're short because we want to see if they can stick within a word count the way that Jessup rigidly requires. We want to see that they can meet a deadline, because, by the way, if your memorial is late, you are eliminated from the competition. And we want to see if they can be concise and write clearly. We take all of that data together, and we then select our teams based on that. But we use some intangibles as well. Have they demonstrated during the course that they play nicely with others? I don't want a diva, for example, who is really, really good, but treats the rest of their classmates like garbage. That does not a good teammate make. We also look at whether they've competed before. If they have, they may get an extra boost to get on the team for a second year. That's our approach. Some schools simply do an audition, essentially, where they get a writing sample and they have a person speak about some pre-canned topic. There are a number of different ways to do it, but those are just a couple.
Okay. Anything anybody wants to add to that, to give you your perspective? Madhavi, you've obviously selected a team. What method do you use?
I think the team dynamic aspect is super important. You do not want a diva. I think something else to consider is that Jessup is a mixture of the research, the grunt work that you do beforehand, and then the advocacy aspect. So
you're breaking up a little bit, certainly on mine. So we'll move on. You can come back in a second, and we'll hope it's sorted itself out. In terms of picking out the issues, Armand, how do you go about? You get a 6,000 word problem question, sometimes called the compromis. How do you go about sort of finding what the issues are and what you should be focusing your research on?
Well, I think before even trying to focus the research, it's very important to read the whole thing as a team several times. because I think the biggest danger in Jessup is that different members of the team go off in different directions, and there's a lack of communication and a lack of coordination about who's researching what. So I think that's the most important first step. I think after that, it's good to take a week, possibly a couple of weeks, if it's a very complex problem. In the last few years, we've had some really very long problems. Not that that's a bad thing. And so that requires a certain amount of time to sink into. So to give the students or the team a week or a couple of weeks just to explore without any particular direction or aim what they can find relating to the problem, what similarities they can draw between the problem and real life events. And then all of this can be brought back together and discussed as a team. And it's from that point of bringing everything back together that you're able to assess what the problems are in relation to the prayers for relief, which are of course going to be the center of the focus, as those are the 4 questions which need to be argued or answered. And then after that, there's the challenge of allocating students to individual problems. And for that, there are a number of approaches, be they by interest. If someone is particularly passionate about an area, they're often going to be keen to sink their teeth into that area. But also thinking about what's been said before by others about team dynamics, sometimes interest is less important than allocating team members according to the people with whom they get on and with whom they work well. The ability to work together on a problem is at the core of the point of the Jessup. It's to work as a team. So if you can allocate areas of research or problems on the basis of 2 or more students per problem who can work well together, then I think you're on a good path. Brilliant.
Madhavi, do you want to have another go and see if you can go on to that and go back to what you were saying? It's better now, yeah.
Is it okay? Sorry about that. I think something to consider as well is, because the Jessup is set up as being research heavy on the one hand, but it is an advocacy competition on the other, to consider when you're selecting a team if you want to have some people that are more focused on the research end and some people that are just really star speakers, or if you want to have more of an overall well-rounded team. And these are things you might consider in just the personalities you pick out when you're looking for a team. The other thing as far as team goes is, I think the most important thing you can do for your team is to make sure you've got a really strict timeline. Like, we want to reach this milestone by then, and this is the point when we'll allocate roles to different people. And as far as personalities in the team go, there are certain styles you can look out for that suit themselves to different roles. If you've got a person who, for example, is super pleasant in their demeanor, is really good at explaining things, you might want to have them as a first applicant because they set the scene. They're the first person to speak, and that can be a really, really good introduction. If you have somebody who loves picking apart someone's argument, who's a bit more feisty, you might want to have them as a respondent because they'll go up there and take the other side and tear their argument to shreds. And so these types of things are things you can look out for in the beginning when you are assembling a team. But yeah, I think that's how I would go about it.
Brilliant. There are a couple of questions that I'm just going to answer briefly, and I think I can do it. Can a law exchange student join the Jessup team? Yes, is the answer to that. As long as you're affiliated to the university you're going to be representing, then you absolutely can, as an exchange student, do it. And that happens not infrequently. There was a French team that won the Jessup about 20 years ago. Every single person on the team was British. So yes, it does happen. Not sure if I missed this, but are there any year of study requirements? Can someone from year 1 join? No, absolutely. I mean, I think has been said, a little bit of experience is probably no bad thing. And obviously over the course of law school, you will get more experience and therefore should be getting better, but there's absolutely no year of study requirements. And indeed LLM students can do it, but nobody beyond that. So yeah, absolutely. So let's carry on and ask, I think, Joshua, if you doesn't mind telling us a bit about the basics of research and how you sort of begin to take an issue and find out what you need to know about it.
Yeah, of course. I think the starting point is always the basic materials that are given out, that are sent out. I'm not sure if you guys are doing it for this year. I'm assuming you are.
It will be being done. I think they come out in about a couple of weeks' time. And that's a collection. I'll let you explain what it is, Joshua. Go on.
Yes. So the basic materials are essentially a collection of resources that are created or curated per se by the Jessup organizers, and they usually consist of first, 5 to 7 documents that are essentially present in every single set of basic documents, like the UN Charter or any of the other relevant treaties. And then it goes on to a little bit to material that's more specific to the problem question for that particular year. And it's immensely helpful because it gives students and coaches alike this sort of area of focus at the very beginning when the problem question is so immensely large. And I think that's always the good place to start. And once you've gone through those, once you've had a better idea for what the key issues are within your specific prayers, then you can start doing some more research on external databases through books. And in particular here, I highly recommend anyone going through the process of research to brush up on their use of Boolean phrases, because that is immensely helpful when it comes to searching databases, and it allows you to narrow down your search quite significantly, because what you're doing essentially is searching the entire internet for things that may exist but they're hard to find. And yes, once that's done, then you could just keep searching, keep narrowing. It's always a process of refining it, because I still remember from my experience up till the day before the international rounds, we were still doing research and we were still finding something new. So it's a never-ending process, but as long as you stick to your guns, have good research practices ready, like using those phrases, you're not wasting your time, then it's perfect. You should be fine.
Great. And in addition to that, it also has access for teams that are registered to some of the major databases, so Hayden Online and Oxford University Press and Westlaw. So even if there isn't a particularly great law library in your institution, there are still those options to go online on some of the major databases, which are available free, as I say, to all of the teams that are registered in the competition. So again, that really does help in leveling the playing field between those that have got a great library sitting behind them, those that don't. So Dagmar, how do you begin to structure a memorial? How do you go about putting a memorial together? That's, for those that don't know, the written competition has 2 stages, written and oral advocacy. The written is 1/3 of the marks, the oral is 2/3 of the marks in broad terms. How do you go about putting that structure in place?
Well, there's a couple of different schools of thoughts on that. When you get your problem, you will have 4 questions. The questions may or may not be equally weighted. In other words, they may or may not require equal amounts of written attention. And you will have anywhere from 2 to 5 people on your team, right? So if you're lucky enough to have 5 people, and this is not what we do, but some schools will assign a position already for the oral argument to each speaker that's going to be speaking, because often the 5th person will be on brief and will not be speaking. And so they'll say, okay, if you're the first applicant and you're responsible for the first 2 questions on the applicant side, you will write the section of the memorial that deals with the applicant side. If you are the person who's the second speaker for the applicant, you will write the 3rd and 4th questions, so on and so forth. And then the 5th person will be the person who's responsible for kind of unifying that and bringing all the pieces together and supplementing. That's what a lot of schools do. Some schools will do something slightly different, and they will assign someone, and I know I can be corrected on this from our Australian friend, but it's my understanding that some of the Australian schools will have people who are almost exclusively responsible for preparing the memorial, who may well differ from the people who will actually be doing the oral argument. What we do is a little bit stranger, but we found it to be very, very effective, because it teaches you to see the other side. If we have, let's assume for a moment, 4 students, each student is assigned 1 question that they will actually also be responsible for arguing, but they must write both sides. The other person will then also, at 1 question, which they will be responsible for arguing, they will write both sides. All right. Then when it comes time to do the oral argument, they will not only understand the opposite side of, let's say, question 1 for the applicant, they'll understand what that looks like from the respondent perspective, but then their teammate who has written the second question, right, and their teammate is probably going to be on the respondent side, will teach them then that question for oral argument. And so you have this cross-pollination of how the arguments fit together, what the pros and cons are of each side in each position. It's a little bit complicated, so you do have to kind of draw it out on a piece of paper or you'll forget. I do. But it really is useful to us anyway for a couple of things. Training teamwork very, very early in the process. Answering any questions where sometimes the questions presented overlap, right? So it helps us deal with that kind of overlap scenario in a more effective way. So that's the approach that we use. And we have some challenges because of our academic calendar. They write these over the Christmas holiday. So that presents a few challenges in terms of working together. And not too much time, but at the end, when everyone has their initial drafts together, I insist that they come home early from their holiday break and get their little butts in the library and work together on all 4 sections, on the editing, making sure you get within the word count, etc. Because I'm not allowed to do that as a coach. And that only works if everyone does it together.
Thank you. Let's get a second perspective on the memorials. Armand, what's your take on how to go about writing a good written pleading?
I would agree with everything that's been said by Dagmar. In fact, I agree with the idea that you should, as a student, see both sides of the argument, because I think that whereas when you're writing the memorial, it doesn't particularly matter. When it comes to mooting it makes everyone's lives much easier, and it makes for a much better understanding of the problem in its full depth. But I think the key point in my mind to memorial writing is timing. Memorial writing is a very time-consuming process, and that's part of the challenge of Jessup. You really do need all the time you have to write it, but you can't sacrifice your entire life to it. And I think it's important to recognise that students have their studies alongside the Jessup, and so organisation, just as it's important on the professional side of the law, is important here. And strict timetabling of how long each line of research will take, and regular checkups with the whole of the team are very important to make sure that no concept has been missed and won't reappear like some sort of evil spectre towards the end of the process, ready to make everyone's lives very complicated. This also applies to the formatting and the indexing, which in my opinion always take longer, or in my experience, always take longer than you expect them to. And memorials can be written in a number of styles, and they can be formatted in a number of styles, but you do want them to be neat and to be well organized and well indexed. And that's something you have to leave a few days for towards the end. And so in my mind, putting aside the research, it's that organization, it's that timetabling which enables the memorial to be finished on time, but also enables students to still be able to study their courses without the memorial becoming an all-consuming piece of work, which it really ought not be, in my view, given that this is a student competition first and foremost.
Brilliant, thank you. I'd also say that on the ILSA website, everyone will be able to find the previous best memorials in the competition. So in the history section each year, the Baxter, as they're called, the Baxter winners are there. So it gives you an idea of what a good memorial looks like. Dagmar, you wanted to say something?
I found this comment about the timetabling really interesting because in 30 years of coaching, I have never had a team that met their own self-imposed deadlines. And because ours is a pass, no pass arrangement, I can't even fail them for failing to succeed. So what do you guys do if you're, from the sound of it, essentially student coached or volunteer coached when someone inevitably does blow a deadline? How do you guys deal with that?
Madhavi, what do you do?
I think there are 2 aspects that are important. I think it's the individual deadlines for each person, because different people have different working styles. They might have different commitments that conflict with Jessup timelines. So I think having an eye on what the students' individual deadlines are as well, to make sure that you can figure out when they can deliver work, and then having the collective deadlines, like setting hard deadlines for this is when everything needs to get done. What we did, which nobody that I coached is here now, is okay, great. So what we did is we set them a deadline, and then we had like an actual internal deadline, which was a day later. So we'd always leave a day of wiggle room. But luckily, we were quite lucky that they never really went over that deadline. But if it was coming up to that evening and it wasn't done, we'd say, well, I suppose all of you are going to have to go and put out fires. And the nice thing about having a team is that if there's some, like a particular issue where they're really struggling, you can they can pull together and work on that. So I think as a coach, not lying to them, but giving them deadlines that are slightly before the actual deadlines can really save you in the end, and always just planning in more time than it actually takes.
Brilliant.
I used to do that all the time till they published the actual deadlines on the ILSA website, and then my my internal deadlines went away.
Brilliant. Very, very briefly, we're going to just talk about oral advocacy and what to expect in a minute. Joshua, what's the key thing about turning your written research and your written memorial into a good oral advocacy?
It really just boils down to practice, I'd say, because it is only you can spend a lot of time writing your memorials. You can have this idea of what your arguments are as well as their corresponding details. But when you're placed in front of a judge in the moment, it all falls apart, so to speak, right? Because then it really makes you wonder what's the most important part of your argument that you have to put before the panel. And you can only really get a full sense of what's important through repeated practices, through repeated pleadings with a wide range of judges. It can be students, it can be your professors, who all can offer these small bits of input from their end, their wise words of wisdom, I guess, that help you curate and sort of narrow down what you think are the key parts of your speech or your presentation, so to speak. And along that note, I think the other thing to note here is it is extremely important that after your practices, at least from an advocate's perspective, that you go back through and think about all the feedback that you've been given and try to see what you can do better for the next time, and what you could try doing differently, because it's very easy to get stuck in one style of pleading or one way of structuring the arguments. But it's also helpful when you're leading up to the national rounds or the international rounds, that you switch it up a little bit, that you experiment with multiple ways of organizing your arguments to see whether it works well for tribunal or your panel, because it's in those moments that you realize how easy it is to understand your argument to a lay panel who hasn't necessarily spent that much time compared to you in the materials.
I think there's another thing, which is not to submit your memorials before you've actually mooted the question. And it's amazing, and I see it in practice as a judge, that something that's written on paper can fall apart in about 30 seconds when somebody asks you a question you weren't anticipating. So actually saying it out loud and getting somebody just to tease it and just to test whether it's actually as clear as you think it is in your own mind is an enormously useful process for trying to refine any particular form of argument. And so I think that's probably a very useful piece of advice as well. Well, the hour is up, and I think it's probably important we don't go over. So I'd just like to thank all of our panelists for the time they've given, the insight they've given. It's been, I hope, useful to people. Just a few other things. We'll be doing a subsequent session on memorial writing, specifically so later on in the autumn. There'll be another session in relation to oral advocacy in the new year. So some experienced people just giving some specific information in relation to how you might go about those particular issues. And the other is to say that I'm really pleased that a number of people, a number of organisations have agreed, in addition to White and Case, to sponsor the competition this year. And that's going to be used to give some bursaries for teams that particularly are outside of London, who have the travel costs, the accommodation costs in London to defray some of those. And there'll be, I think, 5 bursaries up to £1,000 per team to assist with those costs. And we're particularly grateful to COMBAR, which is the Commercial Law Bar Association, to 1 Essex Court, to 4 News Square, and to Quadrant Chambers for their support of the competition. We are very, very grateful to them, and I hope that'll at least allow some teams outside of London for whom money might be an issue to participate when they might not otherwise be able to do so. So thank you very much for your attention. By all means, drop me an email if there's any specific question you have, and I'll do my very best to assist. But I hope to see you all in late February at the national round, participating away. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for attending.
Very cool.
Thank you.